to have you all here today. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention one item for those of you who are following elections closely. On Monday at noon, pardon me. No, I'm sorry, Monday at 1 o'clock, we'll have a debate here, also virtual, between Senator Rebecca Roush and Representative Sean Dooley, the two candidates running for the Senate seat currently held by Senator Roush. Politico calls it the one legislative race that you should be watching, and we're really delighted to have, I think, one of their only debates that they're doing together. So love to see you Monday at 1 o'clock here via Zoom. You can register on our website. But today we're here to talk about question one, which is to amend the state constitution to create an additional tax of 4% over the income of $1 million, which is on top of the 5% flat rate tax that we already have, for the purpose of providing funds for public education, roads and bridges, and public transportation. And there's a summary of that in the chat, and you can certainly will hear more from both of our speakers about what that means, what they think that means, how they interpret it, and what it might mean to you. We are going to hear a presentation from both sides of the ballot question, and then have an opportunity for to answer some of your questions at the end there. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A part of the thing. If you want to just discuss and chat with each other, we'd love to see that. Go into chat and have a conversation among yourselves. A reminder, when you go into chat, select everyone so everyone can see what you have to say, not just the panelists and hosts. So today we're going to hear from Eileen McAnneny, who is president of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, which is the state's leading tax policy organization focused on state finances and the state's economy. But before Eileen, in support of a yes vote, we're going to hear from Andrew Farnitano, consultant at Crawford Strategies, who serves as communications director for Fair Share Massachusetts, the campaign working to pass question one on the #1 ballot. So reminder, put your questions into Q&A. I already have some questions we got ahead of time. We look forward to this conversation and this presentation. Andrew, welcome. It's all yours.
Thank you, Greg.
Yep.
I'm going to share my screen here and let's see. All right, welcome, folks, and thank you for joining us today. Excited to be here talking about question one on the November ballot, which is known to us as the Fair Share Amendment. So a little bit about what question one does. Question one, as Greg said, is a constitutional amendment. So it's not a regular ballot question like we're used to seeing that has the force of a law. This is a constitutional amendment that would be permanently embedded in the state constitution. And what it would do is create a 4% tax on the portion of a person's annual income that is above $1 million. It would adjust that $1 million threshold for inflation. So in future years, if we continue to see inflation, that $1 million threshold would rise so that it continues to affect only a substantial amount of annual income. And that tax is projected to generate $2 billion annually in new state revenue. And that revenue would be dedicated in the constitutional amendment to transportation and public education. So the amendment states that the funds must be spent on those two areas. That could include everything from K through 12 schools and public colleges and universities to early education and vocational training. On the transportation side, this is both public transportation, trains, buses, ferries, as well as our roads and bridges all across the state. And question one only affects the highest earning 1% or less than 1% of taxpayers. And as we talk today, I will get into a little bit more about who and who wouldn't pay more under question one. So a little bit first about how this tax would work. Question one would apply only to the amount of a taxpayer's annual personal income that's over 1 million. It's known as a marginal tax increase. So someone who earns $1 million or anything less wouldn't pay anything more under this proposal. Someone who earns 1.1 million would only pay that extra 4% on the $100,000 that they earn that is over $1 million, just $4,000 extra. That 4% is equal to $40,000 on each million after the first. So someone earning 3 million would pay 80,000. Someone earning 5 million would pay 160,000. So no one is getting hit with an abrupt major tax increase as soon as they pass that $1 million threshold. It's marginal after that rate. And the estimates from the State Department of Revenue are that only 24,000 households, which is approximately 0.7% of households in the state, would be affected by this tax each year. So we're talking about less than 1% of all taxpayers in the state who have incomes over $1 million and would pay anything more. Like I said before, question 1 is projected to raise approximately $2 billion in additional tax revenue each year. There's been a series of different projections ranging from 1.3 to $2.7 billion. The Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center has studied these different estimates and concluded that $2 billion is a reasonable estimate of how much would be brought in each year. Obviously, that could be larger or smaller in individual years, depending on the performance of the stock market, the overall performance of the economy, and other factors. And importantly, the amendment that question 1 would place in the state constitution would require that the new money is spent only on transportation and public education. I have the language up here on the screen. And it includes a phrase that's really important: subject to appropriation. That's a legal phrase. What it means is that the legislature will retain the ability that they are given in the Constitution to appropriate money, to decide that this amount of money goes to this budget line item, that this amount should be spent on bridge repair, or this amount should be spent on hiring more counselors in our schools. This amount should be given to the MBTA. Those types of annual appropriation decisions would still be made by the legislature. They would still have the flexibility to determine which funding areas are most necessary in any given year. But they would be held accountable to that constitutional restriction that the money raised by this amendment must be spent on transportation and public education. They couldn't choose to spend it on other valuable, important priorities like public safety or healthcare. They could only spend the money on transportation and public education. And that requirement would be embedded in the Constitution. So the only way to change it or to change other aspects of this amendment, like the $1 million threshold, would be to go through another constitutional amendment process and change it through a vote of the people. So a little bit about the areas where we believe question 1 can make a real difference in our state. First and foremost is public education. Our schools are really struggling as a result of the COVID pandemic and the lack of adequate support that we have to help our students recover. They need more now than ever before, both on the academic side as well as social emotional support, mental health. Students are really struggling, and we're at risk of an entire generation of students falling behind and never catching up. So our schools need more support. They need to hire more teachers, counselors, and staff, everything from bus drivers to paraprofessionals and classroom aides. We need to be repairing and replacing our aging school buildings. We have so many school buildings across Massachusetts that were built 50, 60, sometimes 70 years ago and have hardly been updated since then. I'm talking about schools that have leaky roofs, schools where the windows don't open in the summer, even when the temperature is above 100 degrees. Schools that lack modern lab facilities, technology, schools that don't have Wi-Fi. If we want to be preparing students for the careers of the 21st century, we need 21st century school buildings, and it's going to take additional funding to make those investments in districts all across the state. We also need to make sure that students have access to a well-rounded education. Right now, we see that in some wealthier communities, it's taken as a given that students have access to STEM education, athletics, music and art classes, but in many of our schools, especially in gateway cities, but also in rural communities, in even middle-class communities that don't have the property tax base to support these programs themselves. They've had to make cuts. They've had to eliminate some of these programs, and we need to ensure that all students have that access to a full education to prepare them for careers or for college. And finally, question one can help expand access to vocational and technical education. Right now in Massachusetts, we have a huge shortage of workers for jobs that require more than a high school education, but less than a college degree, with members of the baby boomer generation retiring in many industries like advanced manufacturing. There is a need for additional technical education, both in the high school level and in the community college level, and that will take more funding that question one can help provide. Next, our colleges, our public colleges in Massachusetts have become increasingly unaffordable. We have some of the highest tuition and fees in the country as a result of state disinvestment over the past 20 or 30 years. The amount of funding that the state provides per student has declined over the last couple decades. And as a result, our students, even middle-class students, cannot afford to take on a huge amount of debt to get a public college degree. So we need to be increasing funding to our public colleges, increasing scholarship aid, decreasing tuition to educate more students who will stay and work here in Massachusetts. And then on the transportation side, we really have a need to invest in our transportation infrastructure across the state. There was a report that came out from a researcher at Salem State University earlier this year that found 644 bridges across the state are structurally deteriorated. That means that they have a major load-bearing component that is in need of repair or replacement, and tens of thousands of people every single day are driving across these bridges that are badly in need of repair. On the screen here is a bridge just around the corner from my home that's been closed. Bridge that runs over the Northeast Corridor Amtrak line has been closed for several months and isn't going to be replaced for several years because it was abruptly closed due to a structural issue. This is a problem many of our communities have. We need to be more aggressive about repairing our infrastructure before it comes into a poor condition and has to be shut down in an emergency. That type of disruption isn't good for our economy, and we need to be more proactive. And especially on public transportation, I think we all saw, whether we were riding it every day or observing, the Orange Line shutdown was an example of what happens when we fail to maintain our transportation infrastructure in good condition. The result is people losing access to their jobs, longer commutes, more traffic. So we need to be making proactive investments to repair the MBTA, to run more frequent bus commuter rail service, run more frequent subway service. That will take additional funding. I think everyone acknowledges now that the T is in need of more funding, both to make capital investments as well as on the operational side to operate the system that we have. And we also need to, as we tackle climate change and continue to see population growth, we need to be creating new connections, whether that's east-west rail, additional rapid bus transportation. We need to be investing in the public transportation system that helps move people around our Commonwealth and links people to jobs and opportunity. So a little bit now about who would pay more and who wouldn't under question one. Like I said before, question one only affects the top 0.7% of households who earn over $1 million in a single year. And importantly, the vast majority of the revenue is coming not from people who earn a little bit over $1 million and would pay a few thousand extra, but from people who are earning over 2 million, over 5 million. People who earn over $5 million a year would pay 70% of the revenue generated by question one. And that's from direct result of analysis of data from the Department of Revenue of the Massachusetts taxpayers who earn over $1 million. And what that would do is make our tax system more fair. Right now in Massachusetts, people in the top 1% pay less of their income in state and local taxes as a share of all of their income than the rest of us do. That's due largely to some of the other taxes in our state that have a regressive impact, where lower and middle income people are paying more of their income in taxes. Question 1 would help fix that, make our tax system fairer by raising the amount of income paid by the top 1% to closer to what the rest of us pay as a share of our income. And a little bit about who wouldn't pay more. So it's important to know that question 1 is a tax on personal income over $1 million. It wouldn't affect business taxes. The corporate income tax is a separate tax that wouldn't be affected. There are many businesses that file as sole proprietorships or pass-through entities, S-corps, that pass their business income, their business profits onto their personal income taxes. They don't pay the corporate income tax, they pay personal income taxes. But it's important to know that question 1 doesn't apply to any business's revenues. Any business that has $5, $10, $15 million in revenue, that doesn't matter when it comes to question 1. Only business owners or shareholders who earn more than $1 million in personal income in a single year will pay more. And I'll walk through an example of that in a second. But less than 3% of business owners have taxable personal income over $1 million that would be subject to question 1. And businesses will also benefit when we have a more educated workforce, more people trained for the jobs that our economy needs, and a transportation system that works to get people around. So here's an easy example. If you consider a business that has $3 million in annual revenue, but spends $2.7 million of that on their payroll, their rent, equipment, other business expenses, that company is left with an annual profit of only $300,000, which is then passed through to the owner, and she pays taxes on it as part of her annual income taxes. Even if that's combined with a salary that she receives or some other income, as long as her personal income is less than $1 million, she won't pay any more under question 1. So many businesses that have more than $1 million in revenue would not be affected by this tax as long as their owners have less than $1 million in annual income. Similarly, there's been some ads and headlines recently about home sales. It's important to know that less than 1% of home sales in the state generate enough of a capital gain to be affected by question 1. Last year, it was only 895 homes. And that's because it's not the sale price of a home that is subject to income tax. It's the gain in value since the home was purchased, minus many different tax deductions. So home sellers can deduct $500,000 from their taxes if they're selling their primary residence, and you can deduct any major improvements that you made that add to the value of the home over the years. You can also deduct many other expenses such as realtor fees and other closing costs. So only a tiny percentage of home sellers would see their taxable income rise above $1 million, which is what matters to question 1. And let's be frank, people who are making over $1 million in profit from the sale of a home can afford to pay a little bit more on that second or third or fourth million to improve our public schools and fix our roads and bridges, which have a much more important impact on property values than a small change in taxes. So another example here, if a retired couple purchased their home for $200,000 and sells it for $1.7 million, they can deduct the purchase price, they can deduct any money they spent on major improvements, and they can deduct $500,000 for selling their primary residence. So that could bring that $1.7 million sale down to a capital gain of $800,000. If the couple doesn't have substantial additional taxable income, they wouldn't pay any more. Even if they have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in additional taxable income that year, and it brought their taxable income to a little bit over $1 million, they would only pay a little bit more, a very small percentage of the house's sales price. So again, businesses and home sales are not a substantial contribution to the revenue raised by question 1. Most of the revenue is coming from people who are making substantial amounts of money each year. Again, $5 million or more. Those individuals are generating the bulk of the revenue. So finally, I just want to close talking a little bit about who's supporting question one. We have a really broad coalition across the state, including labor, community, and faith groups, social service and nonprofit organizations, municipal bodies all across the state, businesses. We have over 80 individual businesses who have endorsed the question, everything from large businesses to neighborhood mom and pop stores that understand that this question will improve education and transportation, that makes a big difference for their businesses, and that if you're running a small business and not earning more than $1 million in personal income, you won't pay anything more. So with that, I'm looking forward to answering questions in a bit, but thank you for the opportunity to be here, and we would, as always, appreciate support from any of the viewers or businesses who are here today.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Andrew. Really appreciate that. And we'll turn it over to Eileen for a presentation, and then we'll have both of you come back and have a conversation. Eileen,
Great,
it's all
terrific. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here. I'm Eileen McAnneny, President of the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. Next slide, please. So a little bit about MTF. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization. We're focused on state and local finances and positioning the Commonwealth for long-term economic growth. And so my concerns about question one are based both on fiscal concerns and economic ones, and I'll outline those in just a moment. So next slide, please. This is the entire language of the ballot initiative, and I think it's important for a couple of reasons. I underlined all revenue, and we can talk about what all revenue means in just a moment. The subject to appropriation, it is important to point that out. It does give the legislature discretion over how the money is spent. And the other thing I would point out is this will go into effect for tax years January 1st, 2023, if it is approved by voters. And according to the Department of Revenue, they need an enabling statute to interpret this. I mean, typically people who are familiar with tax laws, a lot of the terms are defined. They need to explain to people how it works and operates. And so it's just that this isn't sufficient language, actually, I think, in my opinion, to implement a change of this magnitude where some people will be seeing an 80% tax increase. Next slide, please. So just very quickly, important to point out what question one does and doesn't do. As Andrew indicated, it embeds a tax rate in the state constitution. And to me, that's very problematic because, as Andrew pointed out, at a minimum, it takes 4 years to change it, should change be necessary. And all I would say is I would point to how different our economy looks today than it did before the pandemic, just 3 short years ago. And so this essentially does not allow the legislature the authority to make any changes should they become necessary. And in the Mass taxpayers' view, they will become necessary. Just someone had asked in the chat the question about what income is subject to it. It is all income. And Andrew had used the term a couple of times, household income. It does impact more than that. Any non-incorporated business pays taxes under the state's income tax code, chapter 62, and all of that would be impact, as would interest, dividends, capital gains, and the like. Next slide, please. What this initiative doesn't do, certainly, is improve Massachusetts' competitive position at a time when that's a real concern. And I'll get to why MTF is worried about that in a moment. It also doesn't guarantee more money for education and transportation. So it is important to point out, even if every dime from this surtax goes to education and transportation, as the proponents intend. It doesn't mean that the legislature has to continue spending what they currently appropriate on education and transportation. As you all know, money is fungible. So the money from this can be guaranteed for education and transportation, but it's not additive. And I say that because there was an amendment that was put forth when the legislature was discussing this to ensure that the money was in addition to the current spend, and it was rejected. So I think most people, when they support it, think that it means more money for each. Certainly not necessarily the case. And in times of recession, certainly very unlikely. It also doesn't really do anything to address income disparity. There's no direct benefits that are going to people of lower economic means. And I think just because there's more money spent on education and transportation doesn't necessarily mean either one will improve. And I would say it doesn't ensure that millionaires pay their fair share. To me, certainly fair share is a subjective term, but I would just point out that currently 72% of all income tax in Massachusetts is paid by the top quintile. So our income tax structure already is highly progressive. And so, you know, and 5% of $1 million is obviously a lot more than 5% of less. So next slide, please. I also just want to talk about DOR's revenue estimate. So important to point out a couple of things. This is an analysis that is based on 2014 data. So it's pretty old at this point and not sure how accurate necessarily it will be. As Andrew pointed out, it impacts a small number of taxpayers. According to DOR's estimate, it's about 19,000. But what that means on average is about $100,000 increase per taxpayer per year, which is sizable, certainly. And I wanted to point out that how the revenue breaks down from this is 32% of the revenue that would be collected would come from wages and salaries. A full 68 or 2/3 of it would come from non-withholding income. And that income is pretty volatile, and it's pretty, it's tied to the economic cycle. And so that means that in good years, you may see it, in bad years, you don't. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So again, the reason that I think that the revenue estimates will fall far short is the volatility, as I mentioned, and the fact that it's a static revenue estimate, which means that DOR looks at just the impact of this change, assuming that all else remains equal. And I think that that's highly unlikely in this post-pandemic environment where people have lots of flexibility about where they live and work. So I'll put a finer point on it in the next few slides. Next slide, please. So this just shows the volatility in non-withholding tax and how there's huge revenue swings. And this is what causes MTF concern about the fiscal impacts of this, because if you're building into the operating budget annual cost, but the revenue that's needed to fund that is highly volatile, and some years it comes in, some years it doesn't, it adds to a lot of fiscal instability and uncertainty. And so that is an issue. And I think it's not a great revenue source to build a budget on. Next slide, please. This just shows, again, how capital gains do vary year over year, how much they tie to the economic cycle. And because Massachusetts gets a lot of revenue from capital gains and was concerned about that volatility, there is a law on the books already that says if Massachusetts gets capital gains in excess of a certain amount, it's roughly $1 billion, then all of that extra money has to go into the stabilization fund, because they recognize you don't want to build annual expenses on this volatile source. The other thing I would say is, and this is one of my concerns, that right now we do use excess capital gains to help replenish our stabilization fund, but capital gains are also a big source of the revenue for this income surtax. And so I just hope the state isn't double counting, right? We're going to use excess capital gains for some of the intentions the proponents put forth, but also as a source for the stabilization fund. Next slide, please. And I will just say this again comes from most recent recessions where there's a huge drop in tax revenues that result. 67% of that $2.6 billion drop off was from non-withholding. So it's, again, volatile. Next slide, please. Here's where I think the biggest concern is, and it's the impact this could have on the Massachusetts economy at a time when there's already some red flags. We just issued a report called Heeding the Warning Signs, and it speaks to the high cost of doing business in Massachusetts and the high cost of living in the Commonwealth, and the fact that as people have more choices, given the uptick in remote work, that this could drive people away. And if you think about the Massachusetts economy, it's based on a talented workforce. It's based on well-educated folks who are entrepreneurs, innovators, investors, and the like. And these folks will be impacted or could potentially be impacted. And to me, I think it will just cause people to think twice about locating in Massachusetts. And I would just say, you know, it shows Massachusetts has been losing our natural population or seeing a net emigration out of Massachusetts for a long time. Typically, we've been able to backfill that with foreign immigration or students who come here and stay. But in recent years, we haven't seen that. So I worry about Massachusetts not being attractive and what it could mean for our economy and the ability to grow in the future. Next slide, please. And I would say, I think an 80% tax increase on those that are affected may cause them to think twice and to rearrange their affairs. And Massachusetts has been losing people. We've lost, you know, over 600,000, almost the population equivalent to the city of Boston. And 75% of the adjusted gross income of the people that left went to Florida and New Hampshire. And to me, I don't think it's a coincidence that Florida and New Hampshire don't have an income tax. And so I think people already have been reacting to Massachusetts' high cost structure. And I think it will cause that trend to exacerbate if question 1 is enacted. Next slide, please. And just, I would say more recently, I think that trend is even more alarming. Massachusetts saw more out migration than all but California, New York, and Illinois. Next slide, please. And I would say a lot of people, you know, say people don't leave over state taxes. It's not a reason to do so. And they'll say maybe it's the weather or other things. I would just say, doesn't seem like that's the case in the most recent trend, because Massachusetts lost 46,000 people. Most other states, all of the other New England states, gained population. So it's not a weather thing. It's not a Northeast thing. I think some of this is due to to circumstances unique to Massachusetts. Next slide, please. Again, finer point on this, of the 67 counties in New England, only 9 of them rather lost residents. 7 of them were in Massachusetts, in the most densely populated counties. Next slide, please. And the people who are moving are the wealthier ones, as this points out. Next slide, please. So the next thing I want to talk about is that there's no guarantee that there'll be the more resources for education and transportation. And again, it's because this money is fungible. Next slide, please. We can race through some of these. So the final thing that I would say is, I think that this, in addition to potentially being harmful to the fiscal stability and long-term economic growth of the Commonwealth, is unnecessary. If you look at the amount of tax revenues Massachusetts has collected in the past couple of years, it's grown by 11 billion or 40% just since fiscal year 2020. The Commonwealth has $41 billion in state tax revenues that it's collecting annually. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we've received $13.6 billion from the federal government for a host of things. That does include, lots of it is for education, whether it's K through 12 or higher education, and certainly early child care with the child care development block grants. And so there is an awful lot of money. This doesn't include the recently enacted bipartisan infrastructure bill that Congress passed that also has an enormous amount of money available. And what I would say too is Mass Taxpayers Foundation is certainly on record as supporting more revenues for transportation. We don't think this is the way to do it. So it's not a binary choice. You can think Massachusetts needs more revenue for transportation and not agree that this is the way to do it, because it has a lot of harmful economic impacts, whereas there are other ways to raise money for transportation that are either more user fees or that are dedicated revenue streams upon which you can bond against and leverage. So I would say that I think that it's a question of whether more resources are necessary, but if you agree they are, certainly there are other preferred ways to do that. And I would say on education, a lot has changed certainly since this was first introduced in 2014, I believe. But back then, state had structural deficits of over $1 billion. Obviously now we're seeing surplus revenues in the billions. But since that time, importantly, with respect to education, the legislature has passed the Student Opportunity Act, and that gives $1.5 billion more when it's fully phased in to K through 12 education. And so at a time when enrollment in K through 12 education is declining. So improvements to education and transportation don't necessarily mean more money, nor does more money guarantee those improvements. I think that we're certainly putting sufficient resources towards K through 12. In MTF's estimation, it's more about having transparency of how the money is spent and having metrics to make sure that we're making progress on what we're trying to do, namely closing the divide in educational attainment. Next slide, please. And just the final piece on the fiscal front is our stabilization fund is at its highest level since it was created. It's estimated or projected to get to be $8 billion at the close of this current fiscal year. And that's certainly a lot of resources that could be available for one-time investments, because once the stabilization fund reaches a certain balance and we're getting close, then we can't put any additional money in. And so, you know, there certainly are resources available for some of the capital investments that Andrew had suggested. And my final point, very quickly, if you could get to the next slide. And I would just say, certainly we have enough revenue. We've triggered Chapter 62F. All of you are aware of it. I don't have to belabor that point. But this is the final point I'll end with, that there is no quick fix for this. And so if it has the impact that it had in Connecticut and some other states that have gone this road, there's no quick way to change it. And my fear is that those that might have been impacted, they will have rearranged their affairs, they'll have moved. They're not going to bring it up, and it's unlikely a legislature will, so that this, once it's passed, it will be very difficult to unravel or to undo. So with that, I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Excellent. Thanks to both of you. And I will say right off that it's obvious that neither of you are elected officials, because you both did it exactly in 20 minutes. So good for you. Thank you. So we're going to take your questions. I want to let Andrew go first, just to respond to some of the things Eileen said, and then I will get into some questions. But Eileen, there was one question for you. A couple people were trying to get the clarity on how this is an 80% increase for those folks. Eileen, can you hear me? Eileen, can you not hear me, Eileen?
I'm sorry, I just I lost a connection. If you could repeat the question.
Yeah. Okay, so the question was just in how is this an 80% increase for the affected individuals? There are a couple of people who asked that for clarification.
Well, I mean, the tax rate is 5%, and so you're going up to 9%, so that's an 80% tax rate increase.
Just that many people asked, so I wanted to just clarify that. Okay, Andrew, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of the things you heard from Eileen, and then we'll get into questions.
Yeah, there were a lot of points there. I think a couple to address. The last point on the education funding and the Student Opportunity Act. I worked on that campaign to pass the Student Opportunity Act. It's an unfunded mandate. The money is not there to fulfill the commitment that was made to our public schools. They funded 2 out of the 7 years of a planned 7-year phase-in. Similarly with the MBTA, there are a lot of plans to spend more money on the MBTA, but the money is not there. The Mass Taxpayer Foundation would like, as I understand it, would like to see gas taxes raised or other user fees that middle class and working people pay. Our position is different. We think that the very rich, those who have benefited the most from our economy's success, can afford to pay a little bit more to make those investments in our schools and roads. And that's a philosophical difference. And that's not about our factual disagreements, which we have many. It's the belief that working people in Massachusetts are already paying their fair share. They shouldn't be asked to pay more. And those at the very top should be asked to pay a little bit more. And I also want to address the question of volatility. There's nothing to stop the legislature from taking some of the funds raised by the Fair Share Amendment and putting them in a reserve fund, saving them for a rainy day, as we do with other capital gains revenue. So regardless of how much they choose to spend each year, question 1 will mean more money than we have now to spend on transportation and education. And our elected officials all agree that it will mean more money for those areas. Attorney General Maura Healey, who's running for governor, was just asked this weekend about this very fact. She agreed that question 1 will mean more money than we are spending today for education and transportation. Legislative leaders have outlined plans to spend more, and I would just say that the tens of thousands of educators and bus drivers and other working people who are behind this campaign would not be working so hard to pass this amendment if we didn't fully believe that it will mean more money in our classrooms and more money in our schools.
So then let me just follow up on that. Because
Can I respond?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah.
So sure. So just a couple of things. I mean, the Student Opportunity Act has been paid for, since it has been enacted. And there are public comments, certainly from elected officials, that there is adequate money within the current budget to fund that. So I don't think that the Student Opportunity Act is in jeopardy of not being fully funded. And I would just say, again, I think that every penny can be spent, from that's raised from the income surtax on education and transportation. At the end of the day, it doesn't mean more will be spent on that. And the legislature had an opportunity to vote on that, rejected it. And I would just point to the recent article in the Boston Globe, where the Ways and Means chair had indicated they can't bind the hands of future legislators. That may be the current intent. It doesn't mean that that intent will be carried forth in future years. And I would say I was one of the plaintiffs in the legal challenge a few years ago when it was introduced as a citizen's petition, not as a legislator's petition. And there is clearly on the record, there is an acknowledgement that the money, that the legislature has authority over that, and it is subject to appropriation. And so that ironclad constitutional argument, it seems like there's a question about that, certainly.
So, and I think that's the one issue that's going to most confuse voters is, Andrew, is it guaranteed or is it not guaranteed?
Yeah, the money raised by this amendment is absolutely 100% guaranteed to education.
And how is that so?
Because it's in the state constitution, that requirement is binding on the legislature. They must spend this money on education and transportation. What Eileen's raised is a different issue, whether the legislature could choose to reduce existing funding to those areas. If they wanted to do that, they could do that today. This question doesn't change the ability of the legislature to spend existing revenues as they want. But regardless of what they do with existing revenues, this will mean additional funding that is dedicated to education and transportation and can only be spent on those areas. And I think this whole question is a distraction. Every single legislator in the leadership of the both chambers, the likely next governor of the state, agree that we need more funding for education and transportation. They have a laundry lists of projects because of the years of disinvestment that we've seen in this state. I don't think there's any question that their top priority in the next year's budget, if this amendment passes, will be increasing funding to our schools, increasing funding to the T and our roads and bridges. It's just not reasonable to expect that they're going to spend it on anything else. Or
And let me just follow. So Maura Healey has said that she would spend it on this, and the legislators say they would, but she won't be governor forever. They won't be the legislators forever. None of us will be here, but this constitutional amendment will continue. I'm just trying to understand how it's guaranteed or how we're assured that this is really what they will do beyond the current existing office holders.
And can I just respond to that? So I would say transportation spending is discretionary, right? I mean, when you look at there are obligations the Commonwealth has, whether they're contractual, whether they're federal entitlement programs like Mass Health and other things. And so in periods of economic downturn, when some of these revenue sources dry up, there are requirements that we spend, that we pay for certain things. And so it leaves less money for discretionary spending. Certainly transportation is one of them. So even if they would really like to spend more, if you just look like in past recessions, that is unlikely to be the case. And there's usually more pressure put for other things. And so it provides more revenue into the state coffers. Perhaps, again, that's if taxpayers impacted don't change their affairs or move. But it doesn't guarantee more money for education and transportation.
So Eileen, let me ask you a question. So we can only vote, voters, we know how many years it took to get this on the ballot. Voters can only vote for the bill before them, or in this case, the constitutional amendment before them. How do we not vote and approve this one, if I'm trying to paraphrase this person's question correctly, this is the one that's before us. Maybe it's not perfect. We all agree we need money for transportation and education. Why not support the thing that's before us, knowing how hard it is to do anything in this state in terms of raising county revenue?
So first of all, I wouldn't say that the need for more money in education and transportation, that's universally held. But I would say the issue is, again, this embeds the tax rate into the Constitution itself. It doesn't give the legislature the authority to be able to amend it. And I think that it's naive to think that it will not have potential adverse impacts on the economy, and that taxpayers impacted will try to just roll over and pay it. I think people will organize their affairs to try to avoid it. And so I think that the elimination of the uniformity clause in the Constitution, or the imposition of a graduated income tax, has been tried 5 times before in the past, and each time it's failed miserably. And I think it's because voters are concerned about giving the legislature the authity to charge different taxpayers different rates. This current amendment, it answers that question by saying, okay, we won't give the legislature that authority. We'll just embed it in the Constitution itself. So it takes that argument off the table, but it comes with its own set, I think, of negative consequences.
I just want to point out, Greg, that this amendment would not make us any sort of outlier. This isn't some new idea. Massachusetts, we're the leader on a number of issues. We would not be the leader on having a more fair tax system. Most of our peer states that we compete with economically, California, New York, New Jersey, even Minnesota and Iowa, all have higher tax rates on income over $1 million than Massachusetts would have with this amendment. And what they've seen is that they're able to use that money to grow a better economy. They're investing it in education and transportation. Eileen talked about the issue of migration earlier. There was a study out of California that found that they also have a problem with migration, with people leaving the state of California, but it's not people earning over $1 million who are taxed at a high rate. It's the middle class who's being priced out. And we're seeing the same problem here in Massachusetts. Middle class families are struggling with the cost of education, struggling to save for their children's college, struggling with the cost of housing. Those are the problems that we need to address by investing more in our schools to make sure that every school district in the state has good schools, to make sure that we have transportation system that's linking people quickly between job opportunities and their homes, so that we can expand the number of communities where people feel like they can live and raise a family. We're not going to win a competition with Florida and New Hampshire and Texas about who can cut taxes the most. That's not the strength of the Massachusetts economy. It's our well-educated workforce. It's being a place where people want to live and work and raise a family. And to do that, we need to continue to make the investments in education and transportation that we can fund with question 1.
I'm going to try to zip through some questions we received here. So no one addressed the impact on a family business owner selling the business to retire. Can you help us understand that? Eileen, you want to go first?
Yes, I would say that, so just, very briefly to address Andrew's last point, I think that there are businesses that are impacted, and I think we don't want to race to the bottom, certainly, but Massachusetts is a high cost state on a number of ways. And so I think that this tax adds to a host of others that do make us an outlier. I just point to the estate tax, where we're one of 12 states that have it. We have the most we have the lowest exemption. It's probably the most egregious. And I think when you think about the Massachusetts demographics, we're an older state, certainly. And so I think that people who may face this, they're selling a business to answer the question, maybe they're selling a home to downsize. They've saved over their life and they have something they'd like to leave to their heirs. I mean, I think folks like that are seeing that and looking at the cumulative impact and the cumulative tax burden. And I think it does cause people to just consider that. And I think, again, it's at a time when we don't need it. There is a lot of federal funds available still that have either yet to be appropriated or they've been appropriated and not yet spent that can be devoted to education and transportation. And the final thing I would say is, have worked on transportation for a long time. I was actually a co-chair of the Commission on the Future of Transportation. I think there's a lot of improvement that can be made to transportation, but we need a game plan first. You don't just ask people to pay for something and then figure out how you'll spend it later. Transportation is really at a crossroads, and I think it would behoove us to kind of have that plan and then figure out the best way to raise money for it, rather than just ask people to pay and figure it out later, as was suggested by one of the proponents in the Globe article.
Okay. Andrew, I want to give you a chance to respond, but when, particularly on the small business level, the pass-through business owner said, "Why isn't this constitutional amendment allow an exemption that covers me, a pass-through business?" And I know it also applies to S-corp businesses where this could fall onto them.
Yeah, so those types of businesses have chosen to organize for those purposes, for tax purposes, to minimize your tax burden as opposed to filing as a corporation or another entity. So those, again, it's important to emphasize that this is not about revenue. You can have as much revenue flowing through your business as you have. The only thing that matters is the money that you're taking out of your business. You're not spending it on employees or rent or other expenses, and you're taking it as personal profit. That's the only income that is taxable in Massachusetts and that would be affected by question 1. And I want to get back to the question on transportation. I think this is exactly how we've gotten into this mess with the state of our roads and bridges, with the state of RT. It's by 20 years of people saying reform before revenue, we need a plan before we can pay for things, relying on short-term budget surpluses or federal aid to bail us out. We are not going to have a working economy if we do not change something and start raising the revenue that we need to invest in the MBTA and our transportation infrastructure across the state. And if 20 years from now, we've had more years of people saying we need a plan first before we ask the very rich to pay a little bit more, we're going to be even deeper in this hole, and it's only going to cost more to fix the problems. We need revenue. I think every organization, even including the Taxpayer Foundation, I've read reports that identify the need for additional funding in the T and our highways, and I think this is a much more equitable way to raise that money than asking road users and transit riders to pay more.
Eileen, you want to just respond to that quickly, and then I'll give you each a chance to just summarize.
Well, again, I would say, as Andrew pointed out, MTF has been looking at transportation finances for a long time. And I think that we put forward proposals, the way to raise additional revenue. I think that it's the potential economic impacts are certainly outweigh or outstrip doing this. So I think there are other ways to raise transportation revenue. And again, I would just say, I think transportation, like much of the Massachusetts economy, is somewhat in flux, right? So as people work remotely, and we've seen a great deal of that, how our transportation system functions and what we do with it is also kind of in a state of flux. And I think it's really important that we just have that game plan. The other thing, so I'll just stop there.
Okay, great. And I'm going to give you one last, I'm grateful to both of you for your time here. We could go on for hours, I think. We will share this video. We will share the slides. Andrew, I'll give you 30 seconds just to make one last pitch, and then Eileen will let you do the same.
Thanks, Greg. Just want to reinforce that regardless of what group we're talking about, business owners or home sellers or all taxpayers, this tax is about asking those at the very top, the top 1 or 2% of those groups, to pay a little bit more, just an extra 4% on their second million to make these really important investments that we need to make in transportation and public education, not just next year, but 10, 20, 30 years from now to have the sustainable revenue we need to make those investments.
Perfect. Thank you, Eileen.
Sure, and I would just say, I think Massachusetts, I think it's unnecessary at this time. Massachusetts has so much surplus tax revenue, we'll be giving $3 billion of it back to taxpayers. I also think that this will make Massachusetts less competitive than it is. And again, our economy is based on innovation, entrepreneurship, you know, a highly talented workforce. And I'm just concerned, given the options they have in this post-pandemic environment, that they'll choose to live elsewhere. It's already happening, as the data I put forth showed, and I'm afraid that this will just exacerbate that.
Great. I'm grateful to both of you. And just to be clear, for everyone who's watching, Andrew is on the yes side and Eileen is on the no side. The election is November 8th, although many people will be voting any day now as their ballots arrive in the mail. Thank you both again. And thanks everybody for watching. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye.